The average American consumes 55% of their total calories in the form of ultra-processed foods. Ultra-processed foods have long been suspected of being at least somewhat responsible for the rise in obesity and metabolic dysfunction in the United States and much of the developed world. Incredibly, the first randomized controlled study to examine the question, do ultra-processed foods cause weight gain? It occurred in 2019, just a few short years ago. And the study concluded, perhaps not surprisingly, that ultra-processed foods, when compared to unprocessed foods, do lead to weight gain. In what is generally considered the most important study on the subject, performed by the top U.S. government nutrition scientist at the time, a gold standard study, a randomized controlled study, researchers randomly assigned participants into two groups, fed one group a diet consisting of ultra-processed foods, and the other a diet consisting of unprocessed foods. Now, before you guess what happened, let me add an important detail. Each diet, both the ultra-processed and the unprocessed, were designed with the same calories, same protein, sugar, fat, fiber, and other important micro and macronutrients. Still, at the end of the time on the ultra-processed diet, participants had gained about 2 pounds from their baseline body weight. Those on the unprocessed diet, they lost about 2 pounds. Now, as a skeptic of ultra-processed foods, as someone who is a big believer in the power of whole foods, of real foods, you might assume that I'd view this study as a slam dunk, a home run, irrefutable proof that science is finally coming around to something that many of us have concluded a long time ago. But that's not the case, because there are some important limitations with this study that make certain associations weak. Limitations I find a bit puzzling. And perhaps more importantly, one of the most important insights that I think we actually can take away from this study, I've never heard anyone talk about. But we're going to talk about all of this today. With that, I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Unconditional with Norby Schickel. It's great to be back behind the mic. If you've been with me before, it's great to speak with you again. If you're new to the show, welcome to you too. We've got an exciting episode. We're going to talk ultra-processed foods. And we're going deep here, okay? We're getting into maybe the most important study ever performed on ultra-processed foods. And more than that, this is a conversation that hits on a few topics that we've touched on a bit before. Okay, but we're going to continue to chip away at this, right? These are questions related to the value of science with respect to human health and nutrition, unpacking the benefits of, and yes, there are many, and costs associated with ultra-processed foods. And I guess what you could call a degree of skepticism on my part for what's often referred to as calories in, calories out, or energy balance, or the law of thermodynamics as an explanation for weight gain and metabolic dysfunction. Now, I am happy to admit my bias right from the start. Okay, this is a perspective which has been informed by my own experience. Okay, a lot of you already know this, but at one point in time, in my adult life, I should say, I was nearly 50 pounds heavier, okay, officially obese based on BMI. I was overweight, inflamed, and I was getting worse every year. But a few simple, powerful diet and lifestyle changes not only enabled me to lose the weight, but also to get lean, to get ripped, and to continue to feel better every year. I mean that literally. But it's also a perspective which has been shaped by reading the work of people like Dr. Weston A. Price. And I'll say not simply reading and listening to what other people say about his work, but actually reading his own words, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, a book in which I believe is maybe the most important book written on human nutrition ever. Okay, full stop. Truly without equal. Price's travels and study of the incredible health of people following what he referred to as a primitive diet, what today we probably would refer to as an ancestral diet or a traditional diet. I might even call a whole foods, right, nutrient-dense diet. But that book is incredible. And it's also a perspective which has been shaped by simply paying attention to the world around me, including the health, longevity, and vitality of the people alive today. And it's hard not to notice that the modern world is struggling when it comes to health and fitness. We've gone through a lot of these stats before, but with 70% of the adult American population as obese or overweight, with an estimated 40% of us diagnosed with cancer at some point in our lives, 23% of us diagnosed with a mental disorder, and nearly 30 million Americans medicated for depression, all of which has occurred despite the greatest rise in technology and medicine the world has ever seen. It just seems blindingly apparent to me that something is off. Something fundamental is off. And while I'm very grateful to be living in a world of modern science and medicine, we would be very wise to think very critically as individuals, because science changes all the time. And I remind you, that is a feature, okay, not a bug. Within my lifetime, the number of times that the consensus scientific opinion has been flipped completely on its head, it's too many to count, right? From the food pyramid to seed oils to our understanding of herd immunity. Is it possible that our very understanding of calories, what's described as the, quote, energy of a food, based on thermal heat generated when lit on fire, which let's just pause for a second and reflect on the fact that that is a very, very different process than how a body extracts energy from a food. Although it would be kind of cool if we did. But is it possible that our very understanding of calories as we know it may one day be accepted as incomplete? Maybe. But either way, whether you were in the calories don't count camp or in the law of thermodynamics camp, we don't need to resolve that now. Okay, we're going to plow ahead, and we're going to discuss one of the most important studies in nutrition science ever. And it deals with the question of ultra-processed foods and weight gain. Do ultra-processed foods lead to weight gain? And this study was performed by a guy named Kevin Hall. For those who listened to my episode on carbs versus fat, episode 24, I highly recommend checking that out if you haven't. But if you did listen to that episode, this name will be familiar. He's the lead author on another study, which has also been described as one of the most important studies on human nutrition. Okay, a study which examined low carb versus low fat diets and the effect on weight loss and fat loss. Now, both of these studies, the study I'm going to talk about today and the study from 2 weeks ago, they're both randomized controlled trials, okay, which makes them somewhat unique from the perspective of nutrition, because randomized control is considered the gold standard when it comes to medicine, but there aren't that many of them in nutrition, right? They're very expensive to do. So Kevin Hall is no lightweight, okay? He was the leading nutrition researcher at the NIH at the time. So I want you to keep that in mind as we dive into the study on ultra-processed foods and whether these foods lead to weight gain. Now, before we get into the study, let's touch on the stakes and context in just a little bit more detail. Okay, I've already given you some of my own personal reasons for discussing the study and why I think it's very significant. But there's a much broader context here. The health implications of ultra-processed foods is actually very significant. At the time of this recording, ultra-processed foods make up a huge percentage of the diet of the average American and many other places in the developed world. A recent study from the CDC says around 55% of the total calories for Americans are coming from ultra-processed foods. And setting aside what you probably suspect about the health implications for just a second, America's growing dependency on ultra-processed foods is not without reason. Ultra-processed foods have a lot of benefits. They're relatively cheap. They're convenient, reasonably tasty. They have a long shelf life. And given the current environment of rising food prices and the decline in the number of families with, say, one stay-at-home parent and time constraints that many families are under, you can see how ultra-processed foods can serve as a much appreciated lifeline for many families. Before we say anything about the health implications of ultra-processed foods, we will and should always keep that in mind, because that's not trivial. Think about it like this. If food is food, if a calorie is a calorie, if macros and micros are the only thing that matters, then ultra-processed foods cannot be a driver of metabolic dysfunction in and of themselves. And therefore, any criticism of ultra-processed foods or suggestion that limiting their inclusion in, say, school lunch or food assistance programs like SNAP will absolutely drive up costs, reduce convenience, and eat into the time of people who are very likely to feel they're already at their limit. As evidence for this claim, we can consider A, the fact that according to government estimates, 70% of commercially available food products in the United States are ultra-processed. Clearly, there's a market. And B, we can look at the very study itself, the one we're going to talk about today, in which the cost of the unprocessed diet in the study was approximately 50% more expensive than the ultra-processed diet. And keep in mind, these two diets are matched for calories and macros and many other important micronutrients. And I believe that's just the food cost. Okay, in other words, that's not including the time or the labor costs associated with the additional prep for the unprocessed diet. I believe they actually hired professional chefs to prepare the unprocessed meals. Right, so clearly, that cost was not factored in. So the point is that this topic is much bigger than my own personal story, and it's much bigger than my own personal bias. We have real-world, very tangible considerations here. And in light of the sharp rise in the increase of ultra-processed foods and the parallel rise in obesity and metabolic dysfunction, the implications for a study like this are very significant. And I'll go ahead and point out that this is not lost on the researchers. But in order to really appreciate the impact here, we got to start on something that very few people do when it comes to this subject. And that is to define what we mean by ultra-processed foods. So what exactly are ultra-processed foods? I think it's fair to say that for most people, the term ultra-processed foods is sort of a, I know it when I see it kind of a definition. Clearly packaged junk foods falls into the category of ultra-processed. But beyond that, things get a little bit fuzzy. But there actually is a working definition of ultra-processed foods. And it comes from a group of researchers in Brazil led by Carlos Monteiro. Okay, and it turns out that this definition is critical to the story that we're going to tell today. Now, they came up with a classification system that they call NOVA. This isn't an acronym, but the NOVA framework groups foods into one of four categories. Okay, and in order to get into this, I'm going to quote from a book that I mentioned before. I like this book a whole bunch. It's called Ultra Processed People, written by Dr. Chris Van Tulliken. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Okay, highly worth the read, highly worth the purchase. As I always say, grab a copy, grab 2 copies, give one away. And he's got some great insights on this study, on Kevin Hall's work in general, right? Actually, both studies, but on this study in particular, and on the NOVA framework and much, much more. Okay, so let's hear from Van Tulliken describing the NOVA framework directly. He says, quote, "The first is unprocessed or minimally processed foods. Foods found in nature, like meat, fruit, vegetables, but also things like flour and pasta. Okay? Group 2 is processed culinary ingredients, including oil, lard, butter, sugar, salt, vinegar, honey, starches. Traditional foods that might well be prepared using industrial technologies. Group 3 is processed food, ready-made mixtures of groups 1 and 2, mainly processed for preservation. Think of tins of beans, salted nuts, smoked meats, canned fish, chunks of fruit and syrup, and proper freshly made bread." End quote. Okay, so these are the first 3. I think they're fairly straightforward. We could maybe have some minor arguments about which should belong in which group. I imagine that many of us might not think of a can of tuna as a processed food, but as a working definition, this is a good start. Okay, category 4 is when we get into ultra-processed, and this is where much more explanation is required. Van Tulliken says, quote, "And then we come to group 4, ultra-processed foods. It's long, perhaps the longest definition I've ever read of a scientific category. Quote, formulations of ingredients, mostly of exclusive industrial use, made by a series of industrial processes, requiring sophisticated equipment and technology. End quote. Okay, that's confusing, but not all. Quote, processes used to make ultra-processed foods include fractioning of whole foods into substances, chemical modifications of these substances. Processes and ingredients used to manufacture ultra-processed foods are designed to create highly profitable, low-cost ingredients, long shelf life, emphatic branding, convenient, as in ready to consume, hyper-palatable products liable to displace freshly prepared dishes and meals made from all other Nova food groups. End quote. Okay, that is a lot. Okay, when we get into the realm of ultra-processed, refractioning foods, we're adding chemicals, we're substituting ingredients as a means of managing costs, as opposed to improving the nutritional profile of the food. And we're really using technology to create something that is unlike anything found in nature, okay? Now, admittedly, there's a lot to that definition here. But if you're looking for the punchline from the team of Brazil, we get it directly from Fernanda Rauber, where she says, quote, it's not food. It's an industrially produced edible substance, end quote. Tell us how you really feel. But this is where things get even more interesting. At least to me, they do. And you won't find this in this study directly. But again, check out Van Tulligen's book, and you'll get a lot of the history here. But Kevin Hall, and keep in mind, this is our top government nutrition scientist here at the time. He designed and orchestrated this study because when he first heard about this definition of ultra-processed foods, right, this NOVA framework, and it was making some waves in Brazil. But when he first heard about it, he thought it didn't make any sense, that a calorie is a calorie, right, law of thermodynamics. So the author of this study assumed that this study would show that when you normalize for calories, specific macros and a few micros, and I'm paraphrasing here, but you would see the same results, whether following an ultra-processed diet or an unprocessed diet. Let's pause there for a second. This study, the gold standard, funded by our tax dollars, top guy in the field, was not to explore the potential damage of ultra-processed foods. It was to debunk the claim that ultra-processed foods were causing weight gain. To me, this is hugely important. And keep in mind, if you caught the episode from 2 weeks ago, this is the same guy who supposedly debunked the carbohydrate model of insulin resistance. Again, with a randomized control trial, one of the very few that we have. Very expensive, funded with taxpayer dollars. I find this significant because one of the key arguments in favor of ultra-processed foods is that even if they lead to weight gain, it's not because the foods in and of themselves are problematic. It's because we overconsume them. In other words, we could still eat them, but we need to just eat the same number of calories we would if we were eating whole, unprocessed foods. If we had a little bit more willpower, you know the story. Eat less and move more. The same thing that we've heard for the last 50 years as waistlines have continued to expand, as our metabolic health has continued to suffer. And as we'll discuss, although this story does conclude, perhaps unexpectedly, that ultra-processed foods lead to weight gain, the study design makes it impossible to challenge the calories in, calories out model of weight gain. And unfortunately, I've seen this misrepresented a lot when people discuss this study, including by people whose work I really like. Because although the meals and snacks were designed to be matched for calories, protein, sugar, fat, fiber, and other micronutrients, they were only matched in presented calories, not in consumed calories. This is a significant difference. The participants in each group, whether they were on the unprocessed diet or the ultra-processed diet, they were free to eat as much or as little as they wanted. And when it was all said and done, it is true that participants gained weight while on the ultra-processed diet, and they actually lost weight on the unprocessed diet. However, the researchers calculated that those on the ultra-processed diet consumed an average of around 500 additional calories per day than those on the unprocessed diet. Again, calories in, calories out. So we cannot really know what would have happened if the consumed calories had been the same. not from this study. And again, this is maybe the most important study on the subject ever. And if you're thinking, well, maybe there's a good reason for this. Maybe it would be unethical, say, to limit calories for some reason. Well, no, not an issue. In fact, that's exactly what was done in the low-fat versus low-carb study that we discussed 2 weeks ago, also by Kevin Hall. So it can be done. Why wasn't it done in this case? I don't know. But given the skepticism towards ultra-processed foods as the cause of weight gain in the first place, given the history of debunking via randomized controlled trial, I'll say this, it has my spidey sense tingling. But I could be wrong. Obviously, I'm biased, but it is something to think about. So let's discuss the study and feel free to come to your own conclusions, right? Of course, while I may have ways I would have preferred to see the study done, I am still incredibly grateful to Kevin Hall and his team for having done it. I'd like to see more like it. Okay, so the study involved 20 people, 10 men, 10 women, randomly split into 2 groups. And like with the fat versus carb study, this is a randomized controlled study, right? So no epidemiology, no self-reporting, strict control over what's being eaten in movement, body weight taken, body fat calculated with DEXA scans, and more. Okay, the total study is 4 weeks. And again, in a format which will be familiar to those who listened to my episode 2 weeks ago, half of the people, 10, were initially put on the ultra-processed diet, which consisted of 3 meals a day plus snacks. The other half, also 10, were put on an unprocessed diet, which also consisted of 3 meals a day plus snacks. And this initial phase lasted 2 weeks. And then after 2 weeks, the groups were flipped. Those on the ultra-processed diets were moved to an unprocessed diet and vice versa. So while the total study was 4 weeks, the time on each diet was only 2 weeks, okay, with no washout period before or after either diet. And I said it in our discussion on the last study, but I'll say it again. I really don't like this. Okay, I'm not a researcher. I get it. I'm just a fitness nerd, Monday morning quarterbacking what I guess is standard. But as a guy who's been into health and fitness for my whole life, 2 weeks to assess changes to a diet, I mean, unless it's really extreme, it's just nothing. Okay, I know these trials are expensive, resources are scarce and all that, but I would have much preferred to see one group just go the full 4 weeks on the ultra-processed diet and the other group to go the full 4 weeks on the unprocessed diet. I think we would have just seen much, much clearer results. Still, when it's all said and done, the study found that while on the ultra-processed diet, participants gained about 2 pounds, and while on the unprocessed diet, they actually lost weight. Okay, they lost about 0.9 kilograms, so an equal amount of weight, also about 2 pounds. Okay, so that's about 2 pounds of weight gain in 2 weeks for the ultra-processed diet, but that's actually about a 4-pound swing when you consider that the unprocessed diet actually lost about 2 pounds. Okay, so that's not nothing, but 2 pounds in 2 weeks, as anyone who's dieted, which I'm assuming is most of us, that's not a massive amount of weight in the grand scheme of things. Over 2 weeks, sure, but at 2 pounds, the numbers on the scale really aren't that reliable. We might be talking about changes in water retention due to sodium intake, as an example. What we'd really like to know is how much fat is being gained or lost. And in addition to body weight, the researchers measured body fat using a DEXA scan, right? And unlike the carb versus fat study that we talked about 2 weeks ago, which again, a dietary intervention that was only 6 days, so the DEXA scan didn't show much. In this case, the DEXA scan showed a gain of about 0.4 kilograms of fat, so about a pound of fat, in the ultra-processed group, and a loss of about 0.3 kilograms, or about 3/4 of a pound, in the unprocessed group over the span of 2 weeks. Now, a DEXA scan is considered the gold standard for measurement of changes in fat mass. And here, I think they're probably at least directionally correct. These are pretty small changes, right? Especially at these low levels, a DEXA scan is very susceptible to, say, differences in fluid retention, something that the researchers do acknowledge. They say, quote, The relative large fat-free mass changes may be due to extracellular fluid shifts associated with differences in sodium intake between the diets. Indeed, individual differences in sodium intake between the diets were significantly correlated with changes in fat-free mass and body weight. Such fluid shifts may also affect the accuracy and precision of the measured body fat changes. End quote. Okay, now what they're saying, it's a bit buried here, is that changes in both fat mass and body weight were significantly correlated with individual differences in sodium intake. Okay, I take that to mean, and I'm happy to correct this if I'm misinterpreting here, is that individuals within the study eating different levels of sodium saw significant differences in the numbers on the scale and the numbers showing in the DEXA scan. Again, something which a longer intervention period, say the full 4 weeks, rather than flipping the groups and controlling for what was actually consumed as opposed to what was presented, could have solved for. So how much of what we're seeing is true weight loss, true fat loss, versus differences in water weight? I'm not sure that anyone can say with precision. Okay, so that's the study in a nutshell. And of course, I've been giving you some of my thoughts as we've been moving through it on the design and on the results. But I want to add a few more. Okay, some very important points for your consideration. We've discussed the limitations with respect to duration. We've discussed what I believe was a missed opportunity with respect to matching the diets in terms of calories, macros, micros, in presented versus consumed, as was done with the low carb versus low fat diet by the same guy. And I want to explain why I think this is such a miss. On the one hand, as someone with a strong bias in favor of whole foods and concerned about the negative health effects of ultra-processed foods, the overall conclusions from this study, they would seem to strengthen my position. But one of my biggest issues with this study is that the limitations I've described in both the design and duration of the study, they leave the door wide open for a wide range of alternate and I believe very reasonable disparate conclusions, quite easily supporting and reinforcing whatever bias a person had before reading the study. For people like me, skeptical of ultra-processed foods, we can point to this study and say, see, ultra-processed foods cause weight gain and fat gain. For people who argue that food is food, it's only the macros and the nutrients that matter, they can point to the increased consumption of calories and say, well, sure, but only if you eat them in a calorie surplus. Otherwise, they're fine. People who are skeptical of food choices in general as a driver of metabolic dysfunction, maybe say opting for a genetic explanation, they can point to the short duration of the intervention, the association between salt intake and weight gain observed in the study, and reasonably argue that not much was actually established here. And from my perspective, they'd have a point. No study is perfect. And again, I very much get that I'm Monday morning quarterbacking this entire thing. But it just feels like a few minor changes would have really improved the clarity of the conclusions. Just my 2 cents. But even with that, there are a few bits of gold here, okay? And they're a bit buried, so you could easily overlook them if you're just focused on the conclusions of the study. Now, even as I've described the lack of control over calories consumed as a limitation of the study, the fact that calorie and macro consumption was not controlled does lead us to some interesting questions. Why did those consuming ultra-processed foods consume more calories? And it wasn't just a few more calories. It's around 500 calories additional per day. Why would that be? Was the ultra-processed food particularly tempting? Maybe the researchers sort of put their finger on the scale inadvertently by presenting very tasty options to the ultra-processed group. But, something like chicken, rice, and broccoli like 3 times a day for the unprocessed group? No, not the case. And again, I'm going to direct you to Van Tolleken's book here, where he points out that if anything, the unprocessed foods appear to be much tastier. We're talking prepared by professional chefs, beautifully presented, and he's not wrong about this. Okay, you can check it out yourself. You go to the actual study and look at the extended version online. And you can see pictures of the meals that were in each of the diets. And the difference is really incredible. The unprocessed diets are A, massive from a volume perspective compared to the ultra-processed, which is very telling. And B, they just look way, way better. Okay, I don't think I'm way out on a limb here. I mean, go check it out for yourself. And words don't really do it justice here, but let's take a look at one meal during the study which illustrates the point. Okay, let's look at lunch on day 5. And, you tell me, what sounds better, even without seeing the picture? So this is the ultra-processed menu, lunch. Spam sandwich with American cheese on white bread. Potato chips, diet lemonade. Okay, that's lunch for the ultra-processed groups. Now let's see how this compares. And keep in mind, these are the same calories, same macros, lots of the same micros. But let's see how lunch on day 5, spam sandwich, potato chips, diet lemonade, compares to what the unprocessed group ate on day 5. Grilled beef tender roast, barley with olive oil and garlic, steamed broccoli, side salad with green leaf lettuce, tomatoes, cucumber, baby carrots, vinaigrette, apple cider vinegar, and olive oil, salt and pepper, and what looks like an entire apple cut up into slices with squeezed lemon juice. Okay, now you compare the two photos, and as I said, a couple things stand out. First of all, unless you just love spam, I am very confident that most people are going to pick the unprocessed menu if given a choice. But the other thing is you just look at it from a volume perspective, and we're just talking about a massive, massive difference, right? It would be interesting if they had maybe weighed the food as like a just rough proxy or given us some sort of volume metric. But, with the ultra-processed option, the spam sandwich, we're talking literally about a single spam sandwich on white bread cut into quarters and like a small bowl of chips versus the unprocessed menu, which is an entire bowl of salad, an entire bowl of broccoli, like a whole apple cut up, what looks to be about, I don't know, maybe like a fist-sized portion, I should say, of barley, plus grilled beef, right? I mean, not a tiny amount of grilled beef. This is quite a bit of food for most people. And so to me, I look at these two menus, I look at these photos, and I think, no, it's quite obvious that if anything, they were putting their finger on the scale the other way, right? When we consider Hall's admitted bias from the start, that a calorie is a calorie, it doesn't matter whether it's coming from ultra-processed or unprocessed, and the fact that the calories consumed were not controlled, like I said, it makes you wonder if maybe even on a subconscious level, if there was an assumption that the unprocessed group would consume more of the better food. I could be way off here, but I don't think that it's unreasonable to wonder. Which makes the question as to why the ultra-processed group consumed more calories, especially given that the presented food didn't look particularly good. I mean, spam sandwiches, right? And here's what I believe to be possibly the most significant line of the entire paper, and you will blink if you miss it. The paper reads, quote, "Interestingly, appetite-suppressing hormone PYY increased during the unprocessed diet as compared with both the ultra-processed diet and the baseline. Also, the hunger hormone ghrelin was decreased during the unprocessed diet compared to the baseline." In other words, it's not just willpower. It's not just because you lack self-control. It's because calorie for calorie, ultra-processed diets do not trigger satiety the way that unprocessed diets do, the way that real foods do. And let's connect this back to what we know about GLP-1 agonists in our episode on Ozempic and the explanation as to why they work, because they crush down the hormones of hunger and they trigger satiety. Defenders of GLP-1 agonists argue that they, quote, restore the natural signaling of satiety. Well, even if that's true, what broke the signaling to begin with? Might ultra-processed foods have something to do with it? In light of what we're seeing here? Yeah, I think so. Now, why don't ultra-processed foods signal satiety in the same way? Is it a lack of fiber? Something else? probably a topic for a future episode. But what this study is pointing to is that clearly they do not. And of course, I'm sure there are some super nerds in the group screaming protein leverage into their speaker right now, an obvious gold star for you. That would appear to be the best explanation that the researchers have. But here, again, is where things just get very, very interesting. So quickly, for those unfamiliar with the protein leverage hypothesis, it's basically the idea that organisms require a certain amount of protein, I guess technically amino acids, in order to live. And while we may not consciously know what that amount is, we will continue to eat, attempting to fill our amino acid requirement until it's met. So if we eat food that is high in protein, satiety will kick in faster, the feeling of fullness will kick in faster, because we meet that requirement faster. If we eat foods that are low in protein, we'll eat much more, because hitting that protein requirement will take much more food. But the researchers anticipated this, and the diets were matched for protein. And not only that, if protein leverage was at play here, you'd expect that most of the additional calories would come in the form of higher protein foods. But that's not what happened. The excess calories consumed primarily came in the form of additional carbs and additional fat. The paper reads, quote, however, if protein leveraging was at work in our study, it is unclear why subjects chose to meet their protein targets via compensatory overeating of dietary carbohydrate and fat rather than selecting foods with high protein content. Kind of makes you think. So while protein leverage may be at work here, the researchers acknowledge that it's not a perfect explanation. Now, what do I think? What do I think explains the delta between the satiety of ultra-processed foods and unprocessed foods? Is it protein? Is it fiber? Sure, I think protein and fiber, they play a role. But I think it's likely something much more fundamental. Something which is found in ultra-processed foods, which is not found in unprocessed whole foods. And those are flavor enhancers. Now, this is definitely a massive topic, okay? Certainly a future topic episode. But it is estimated that there are some 10,000 GRAS ingredients, right? Generally recognized as safe food ingredients, which are added to processed and ultra-processed foods, many of which don't need to be added to the label and are oftentimes added, I would say many times added, in combination with one another. Are some of these added as preservatives? Sure, absolutely. But a good chunk of them are added to do exactly what we're seeing here. It's to encourage you to eat, and therefore buy more of whatever the particular product is. I've made reference to the book Excitotoxins by Dr. Russell Blaylock and the book Swallow This, book with an unfortunate title, by Joanna Blythman. But that is my hunch as to what's really going on here, what we're really seeing. If you just want a preview of some of my thinking, as I said, this is definitely the topic of a future episode, something that we're going to unpack in much greater detail. Okay. I think that's it. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up for today. Said a whole bunch. Very interesting study, of course. Lots to be learned directly and lots that can be connected to, especially when you start considering some of the other episodes that we've covered, right? The connection between ultra-processed foods and satiety and GLP-1s as just an example. So I think there's really a lot here. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you did as well. If you are enjoying the show, if you're getting any value from it, please consider like, share, subscribe to the show, whether it's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you enjoy listening to podcasts. Thanks again, and I'll talk to you next week.